The good news is there's a tsunami of evidence available on how well a variety can improve student achievement. And what I'm going to do today is briefly discuss a couple of study skills that students use, some of which are good and some of which are not so good. I'm going to take the good ones, and they provide the active ingredients to what I'm going to focus on today, which is successive relearning. I'm going to show you some evidence from one lab study. We've run many lab studies on successive relearning. But more importantly, I'm going to focus on a couple experiments that we've conducted in real classrooms. For those of you who are teachers in the room, to give you a sense about the effects that you can enjoy if you utilize this technique potentially in your classroom, but also how we go about evaluating the effectiveness of techniques that we know work in the lab to also evaluate, do they work in real education contexts. So without further ado, let me get to a variety of study techniques. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was asked to write a monograph. In fact, I think that my first talk ever about this monograph was at EdCog 6 years ago. And the smartest thing I did in writing this monograph was first get together a group of really excellent experts and colleagues, collaborators to help me with it. The second and probably the most difficult chore we had to do was literally decide which techniques are we going to evaluate. And the reason for that is that this is just a short list of all the available techniques that students could use to help them learn their content. And how we chose this short list is pretty straightforward. First, we excluded any kind of technique that a student would need to pay for. So things like auto tutors were out. Now, there are a lot of good auto tutors, but we wanted our review to be more inclusive. So any student that's reading this or a teacher could potentially use these techniques with their students. So it's not that auto tutors are bad. I'm sure many of them do a great job, but some of them are extremely costly. The second thing we did was try to pick techniques that we knew students use. Now, highlighting is a no-brainer. You go to the used bookstore, you open any used book, and it's just like a rainbow throw up all over it, right? I mean, every different color you can imagine. Everyone highlights. I even have my own favorite highlighter. Okay. Rereading is something that many students say they go to quite often when they're studying. That is, you read something originally, you hear about it in the classroom, and then you go back and you reread your content. The question is, how much do you gain by just going back and, say, rereading your notes, your textbooks, so forth? We also put a couple of techniques on here that we were pretty sure were effective, but we just wanted to evaluate the available evidence for it. And this took us about 2.5 years to do the lit reviews for all of these different techniques. And at the end of the day, we, for better or for worse, decided to develop a utility ranking, okay? Either low, moderate, or high utility. And the ranking was based on how well these techniques fared with literature search on the questions I posed earlier. Does it help all students? Is the efficacy of the technique been shown in the classroom and so forth? So we can be confident if we prescribe these techniques, there's stuff that students should use. So I'm not going to go through all the evidence. In fact, I'm going to quickly burn through this. I'm just going to show you our utility ratings. So these are the particular techniques that rated relatively low. They rated low for a variety of different reasons. So for instance, take imagery used for text learning. It can be relatively effective, but imagery is only useful for the small percentage of, say, text or content that could be imaged. Okay? So it's not that it's not a potentially effective technique, it's just very specialized. So we gave that a relatively low utility rating. Note, highlighting and rereading are also on here. Admittedly, highlighting, we just looked at the effects of highlighting alone. So if you go through and highlight, are you learning anything from that or versus just reading? And it turns out, no surprise, just highlighting doesn't really boost students' learning of that content. That said, I would never take a highlighter away from a student. It's the beginning of the journey, it's not the end. It's what you do with what you highlight that's going to matter the most. Rereading, in my mind, was a little bit surprising, right? Because you read something, you go back later to reread it. It turns out there's some evidence that shows that students, when they go back to reread something versus do nothing, they gain nothing from going back to reread. It's a complete waste of time. That's just some studies, it's not all of them. But it's relatively inert. Now, the reason for this is pretty obvious for those of you who read late at night, which is many of our students study then. It's if you've read it once, you're familiar with it, your mind starts wandering, your eyes just keep moving across the page, and you stop when you get to your last period. It's not that engaging. So instead of rereading, we would recommend students do basically techniques that are a little bit more engaging when they get there. Okay? 3 of these techniques that I could talk about at Q&A if you want to got moderate ratings. The reason these only receive moderate ratings, however, is not because they weren't shown to be relatively effective for many different students across many different materials, but there was no evidence that they worked in real, authentic classroom contexts. So our call was to researchers interested in these techniques, please start showing us that it can really help move the needle for real student achievement in real classes. Now, in the 6 years since the time we published this, there's been quite a bit of research on interleaved practice in the classroom settings, mainly by Doug Rohr, showing that it can be highly effective for learning math concepts. And I think if we were to redo this monograph today, which we've not been asked to do, I'd probably now put interleaved as a high utility rating. These 2, practice testing and distributed practicing, got high marks on all counts, and for the last 120 years, distributed practice alone has been one of the most studied techniques across in cognitive psychology and education psych. What I'm going to do, I know most of you are probably familiar with these concepts. I hope you are. I'm going to touch on them and then show you how they combine to produce successive relearning, which is what I'm going to do the deep dive into today. So let's talk a little bit about retrieval practice, or also known as test taking. Most students view retrieval practice test taking like this, right? High stakes summative exam where, man, really your life counts on how well you perform. You can almost feel the anxiety in this particular picture. Turns out for all of you students, the teachers don't like administering these that much either, okay? They're just part of the business. It turns out all tests don't need to be high stakes or anxiety producing. In fact, practice tests can be multiple choice tests, fill in the blank test, essay style, recall test that could be administered at the beginning of classes, at the end. Students could administer these on their own. Quite a bit of research has shown that practice testing has a major influence on students' retention and learning of that content. And I'm going to give you one example later on. The reason why testing works is twofold. The first would be a surprise to many students and teachers. And that is when you recall something correctly, right? You answer a test question correctly. Doing so is not inert. It actually influences your representation of that content and improves the retention of it. So success on a test actually increases the likelihood of subsequent success. Now, one thing that's not a surprise to most students, because this is why when students say they use testing, it's for this reason, it's because when you miss something, you realize you don't know it yet, and you need to go back and restudy it, engage in it, talk to your professor, so forth. So it can have both a direct effect and an indirect effect. And let me just describe one study. It's one of my favorite done in this area by Andrew Butler. It was his dissertation. And I like it because he used relatively complicated science texts, like how bat echolocation works. And he had students study this particular text, 1,000 words. These are undergrads, and probably in an intro psych class, doing this for extra credit. And after they studied a text, they would some of the students would have a test and then restudy, and the other students would restudy only. The test focused on either the facts or concepts. So one test, this makes sense, right, that he would give for bat echolocation is, please write down your understanding of bat echolocation. And the students would do their best to write down all of the processes involved. They'd get their test and then they'd restudy. What's very important, the time on task for these two groups was identical. Okay? So while the one group was spending or potentially wasting their time, testing themselves, the other group had all this time to just restudy that text. 1 week later, there was a final test, and importantly, it was inference-based tests. So none of the questions were like, explain bat echolocation, okay, which would just be a regurg of the test they originally received. Instead, it would be, well, how does a bat know if an insect is flying away from them or toward them? Explain to that. And if you understood those paragraphs, you'll answer better on this transfer question. And what Andrew found was pretty straightforward. For the factual questions on this test, they performed substantially better. I mean, this is a huge effect size, ones that most cognitive psychologists typically don't see in their labs. And it's one of the main reasons why we all got excited about this particular technique. It's the same that occurred for the concepts that were more conceptual, right? That really were critical for the inferences. And it's a dissertation, so we ran lots of experiments, replications, over and over again, finding this large effect. Okay? So this is kind of evidence that led us to give practice testing high marks. This is a really effective strategy. Okay? As much as I love this study, in about 10 minutes from now, I'm going to show you why it's really flawed, okay? Why it's limited. Okay? So retrieval practice is what to do. It's a particular technique. Distributed practice is when to do it. Okay? And it's simply spreading out study across time. And I put in parentheses, it probably shouldn't be in parentheses because it's the most important part, is the study of the same content. So many of the students who I interact with think, well, I've studied in 3 different days, but they studied something different on the 3 different days. Space practice is you go back and you restudy or re-engage in the same content on another day. So if you have 6 hours to spend, you spend 2 hours, 2 hours, and 2 hours, but you study that same content in every 2 hours. Much better use of your time than spending 6 hours, right, studying all that content. How this would work is you study relevant material on session 1, come back 2 days later, restudy it, so forth and so forth, and then you have the exam. Now, the alternative to distributed practice is cramming, either a night or 2 before. Okay. Raise your hand if you cram for an exam. Yeah. Raise your hand. Come on. It's like, this is almost like a lie test, it's like a lie detection test. Everyone crams, and I never tell students don't cram. It's fine if you want to study the night before. I do tell them, if you're going to do that, let's not get into this state, right? Sleep is critical for high levels of performance. So if you cram the night before and you're up until 4 in the morning, whoa, really bad news. Okay? And I also tell students, when you're coming back to that cram session, especially if you're practicing retrieval, what you're doing is you're just showing yourself, if you've done a lot of spaced practice, just showing yourself how well you know it, right? It reduces anxiety. You're really ready to go the next day. All right. With respect to distributed practice, it's essential for any kind of long-term retention. It's the most effective when practice is distributed across sessions. Study on one day, come back 2 days later, so on and so forth. And of course, it's especially effective when you're using an effective technique, right, to study in a distributed fashion. So what to do is retrieval practice, and this is something I haven't mentioned, but I'm going to really get into it until you get it correct. When to do it is distributed across sessions, and if retrieval practice and distributed practice were dating, got married, and had a baby, the baby would be successive relearning. Okay? It's taking these 2 really effective techniques and combining them. So the active ingredients are session 1. You learn material to a specific criterion. The best way to explain this, although this is not the only way to do it, is just think about flashcards. Test yourself on one. If you get it right, you drop it. If you get it wrong, you put it to the end. And you keep going until you can correctly answer the question for every one of those flashcards, and then you're done. The key is then 2 days later, you come and you pick that same flashcard stack up again, right? And you go through it. Okay. I know most students use flashcards kind of in this manner, but only for the most simple materials, foreign language vocabulary. It turns out flashcards or the equivalent can be used to learn extremely complex materials. I'll show you some examples later on. So you kind of do the same thing across sessions, and then you finally get your exam. All right. So why is successive relearning critical? And now I'm going to go back to Andy's great study. Imagine that all of these students were in a real class called BAT Echolocation 1, okay? Everyone flunks, right? You might feel better that, you in the testing condition flunked a little bit less worse than your friend who was in the restudy condition, but none of the students learned the content to a sufficient level. What you need to do is go back, and probably in this case, keep testing yourself during that first session until you can really recall all of the stages of BAT echolocation, and then come back and do it another day. So what happens, you forget between those sessions. Long-term retention is almost like an interplay between forgetting, okay, relearning, forgetting, and relearning until you eventually can retain the content. And what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is give you a couple demonstrations of the power of successive relearning. Most of our research has been done in the laboratory settings. I'm only going to present one of those studies because I want to focus on the work that we've been doing in classrooms. I'm saying we a lot. We is because my collaborator and really someone who really pushed most of this research is Dr. Catherine Ross. She's sitting right here. So if I say anything really stupid, she can jump in and correct me. So how do we evaluate the impact of successive relearning? There's two ways that we've been focused on. One is just, what is the potency of relearning? So if you come back, pick up that flashcard stack another time and relearn it on another session, what's the bang for the buck of that? How much do you get? Because obviously, if you keep coming back, at some point, it's going to asymptote. You'll not get any more out of it. We just want to know, how potent is every relearning session? And it's really an issue of dosage in my mind. How much is enough or sufficient for long-term retention? The other one, and this is a bit more subtle nuance, something that cognitive psychologists would love, is, can relearning override the initial effects of variables that impact learning? And I'll explain this as I show you the methodology and why this is important. It's quite frankly an issue pertaining to best practices and what students should be doing across these different sessions, assuming they're not cramming, that they're going to distribute their practice. Okay. So let me explain just one experiment, of which we have many, many like this been done. These are with undergraduate participants, simple materials. Well, I guess Lithuanian is kind of difficult, but just a Lithuanian English pairs that they had to learn, okay? Foreign language vocabulary. During session one, the students learned all of the items, okay, using the dropout technique, right? If you get it right, it gets dropped from the virtual flashcard deck. If you get it wrong, it goes to the back. Okay? We manipulated during that first session something called lag and criterion. So I'm going to slow down and explain what these are. This is important to the relearning override effects. Lag is the number of items intervening between trials. So 7, 15, and 47, think about them as just different sizes of flashcard stacks. So with 8, right, cards on your stack of flashcards, every 7 items you'll come back to the same. With 16, that's a lag of 15. If you study something, you put it at the end, and you'll see it again after 15. It turns out there's been 100 years of research showing immense lag effects. That is, the longer the lag, the better boost for your retention. The criterion is that they would either go until they correctly recalled everything once, or after they got everything correct once, they'd go back and they do it again 2 more times. We know if you basically do it more on that first session, you'll do better than if you do it less. Then they came back to the lab for sessions 2 to 4 to relearn the content. This is the successive relearning. However, during these relearning sessions, all items had a criterion of 1. You just go to it, get everything right, and they all had the long lag of 47. Each session began with a cued recall test. Show the Lithuanian term, have to recall the English. So that particular first test then we could use to evaluate the effects of the prior sessions. And then for any they'd missed, they would have to go and relearn. And in this particular study, the sessions were separated by a week. Okay. So first, let's talk about potency. So this is averaged across all those lag conditions. And after that first session, okay, and a week later, students recalled only 20% of those Lithuanian English pairs correctly. However, by going through that flashcard stack one more time on one relearning session, now retention is about 50%. Okay, pretty big bang for one more interaction with that flashcard. And we see as they have more and more relearning sessions, you see an increase in the potency of that. Okay, now you can notice here that it looks like it's asymptoting. What we found with some of our research with more complex materials, that after about 3 or 4 sessions with the same lag, intersession lag, it asymptotes, right? You don't get much more out of that. My guess is we just have to have a much longer lag, more forgetting, to get a bigger bang there. Okay? But these are the potency effects. You get a big bang for your buck by just relearning that content. With respect to relearning override, before any relearning, right? Some of the items went until they got them correct 1 time, and some till they got it correct 3 times. And a week later, you see, this is effect size D of 0.72, that they're performing better if, right, if they go to 3 times. Not so surprising. Okay? So if you are cramming the night before and that's all you're doing, maybe you should go a couple extra times, right? Because you're going to get a little bit bang, especially the next day. You'll do better. However, what you'll notice here, if then the students relearn all that content, after one relearning session, we see a reduced influence of those criterion effects. Until the final relearning attempt, now relearning is almost, I'm sorry, the criterion manipulation is having almost no influence. That is, relearning is overriding the initial effects of what cognitive psychologists believe are relatively potent variable, right? And it turns out with the same thing will happen with the lag effects. So I just have the 7 and 47 groups here, but no, relatively large effect, right? If on that first day you have a longer lag with those items, you do better than if you have a short lag. But as you relearn those items on these relearning sessions, now that lag effect disappears. Why do I find this exciting? And most students wouldn't. Sorry, guys. A cognitive psychologist. I've read, when I got really interested in the science of learning, some of the big effects were like, tell students to use long lags and tell students to use more criterion and so on and so forth. Not if you're going to relearn. You don't have to do any of that. It's like, in fact, one of the papers that we wrote, didn't get published, was like, throw everything you know about lag, throw it out the window. It's not irrelevant for education. Because if students relearn, then those initial lag effects disappear. Okay. So why is relearning potent? I'm going to just quickly skim through this slide. It turns out that there are a whole host of theories of memory or models of memory that have a few basic assumptions, and many of them say that forgetting begets remembering. That is, if you forget something you've learned and then you relearn it, it really has a major potent impact on your retention. One of the most popular theories in this line is by Elizabeth and Bob York, mentioned here, the new theory of disuse. Their model is not a computational model, so you can't fit it to data. It turns out, and I won't go into any of these details, with a collaborator who was a student of John Anderson, we had him instantiate these ideas using ACT-R, which produced quantitative fits to these kinds of data. And it turns out you've already seen the fits because these are those little open circles. Okay. So with just 2 simple assumptions that the more you forget, the more you learn, we can provide really nice fits to these data. And we're doing projects now where we're doing a little bit more nuanced, where this model is making predictions where other math models, like by Rich Schifrin and so forth, make different predictions. It's a lot of fun for a cognitive psychologist. However, I want to talk more about student education and doing this in the classroom. So this is something near and dear to my heart. I think successive relearning is one of the most potent techniques. Why? Because anything we do successively outside of academia, outside of education, we do it well because we've used successive relearning. We just don't call it that. So I'm relatively good at guitar, and the reason is because whenever I get a chance, I go back and practice the same things over and over until I get it right. Successive relearning. For those of you with children who have something they do well, like dance or video games, why are they good at that stuff? Successive relearning. Just doesn't tend to translate then into education. Okay? Impact in real classrooms are not guaranteed, even though we're showing these really big effects in the laboratory. And the one reason is because we know students cram. We could have a cramming override effect here. So for the content they learn using successive relearning versus those that they just learn on their own in any way they do, well, if you're going to cram the night before an exam, it could level the field. So really doing all this effort, right, with successive relearning may not pay off on that high stakes exam. Now, we think it will pay off in the long term. That is, sure, maybe because of your cramming now you're doing well on all the content, right? But for that content you successively relearned, you're going to retain it for a longer period of time. So when I talk to teachers, it's like, maybe not use successive relearning for all the content, but for that content you want them to retain for that next class. Learn it in this way because it could lead to long-term retention. Okay? Our studies, because of this, focused on successive relearning versus what we call business as usual. How students learn the content on their own. Okay? The idea being that if our technique, or this, not our technique, successive relearning doesn't outperform what students already do, then why ask students to do it, right? Because they're already doing well enough. So I'm going to describe outcomes from two different experiments, two different classes. The first is intro psychology. This is students in a large section of intro psych. There are over 400 students in the class we used. We worked with the instructor very little. In fact, all we did with the instructor, please, for the, I think, exam 2, give us those concepts that you think are most important for your students to learn. She did that, and then we didn't interact with her again. And she gave us 64 concepts, and for each of the participating students, 32 of those concepts were successively relearned, and 32 of those concepts were baseline, that is, business as usual. You guys learn these in whatever way you do, and what we thought most students are doing, right? A couple days before the exam, they'll start studying the content. For successive relearning, this was, by the way, the successive relearning itself was done in our lab, so it's a weird kind of mix match between lab and classroom, right? They came to the classroom, they initially read a paragraph with these concepts in them, and then they had 3 relearning sessions where they had to come back to the lab to relearn the content. And relearning was relatively straightforward. We wrote computer programs to help administer the successive relearning, but there'd be a concept like self-serving bias. A student would do their best, type an answer to it. They would have to score the answer, say whether it was correct or incorrect. I'm not going to get into the details of that because it's difficult to score answers with fidelity, and we have a technology that helps students do this really well. And if they said they got it right, then it was dropped from study. If they said they got it wrong, they'd have to study it again. So here's the correct answer to study, and then they would get tested on it again. During that initial session on day 1, it took students 30 minutes to successively relearn until they could correctly recall these definitions of these concepts. Okay, so it takes a amount of time. By the way, during session 2, the same 8 concepts took them 15 minutes. Session 3, they sat down, 5 minutes later, they were done. Only study I've ever run where I had students asking if their friends could be part of it. We had students saying, I've never learned stuff so well. I can't believe you can do this, right? It's just like many students were blown away at how at least effective they felt it was as they were using the technique. Importantly, the content that they were learning in successive relearning was linked with the class. So when Sharon Scaratelli was talking about social psychology, the students were starting to learn the social psych concepts in the laboratory. Then she went on to learning conditioning, and they were learning those concepts. So it was connected directly with the class. So they were learning in a cascading fashion many variety of different decks. Sharon's test questions didn't simply ask students to regurgitate the definitions. Okay? So they were recalling the content or the meaning of these definitions to mind during successive relearning, but her quizzes were more application style. Certainly they're not far transfer, but near transfer, okay? And again, by the way, it's something I didn't mention, but I want to make clear. When students were trying to recall the definitions from mind, we told them, don't try to get them verbatim. Just give us the meaning of that definition, and that's what they had to score. So it was all about, can you recall the meaning of these definitions? Okay. What we did is we then took all of the exams, and we scored those test questions that were relevant to the items that they successively relearned versus those items that were business as usual. And basically, for those content that they successively relearned, they got about a letter grade and a half better performance. Pretty impressive real-world impact. Okay. Now, we also wanted to evaluate the retention of that content across time. So we had 2 more exams that we administered in the lab. Now, admittedly, these exams were give us the meaning of this content. Okay? And it turns out for that content that was successfully relearned, there was pretty good retention. But again, like everyone would expect what happens with cramming, for the content that was crammed the night before, probably before you even get to the door leaving the exam, you've forgotten it, right? It's just like just enough to get a multiple choice question right. Devastating loss of that content. Okay. In a follow-up study, first we want to replicate. There's a big, really big push in cognitive psychology now, all across psychology, to replicate. I think we were ahead of this trend because we always wanted to replicate what we were doing. So we redid this study, and we had a supervised group. That's a straight replication. We also had an unsupervised group where we had them come to the lab. We gave all the students a flash drive with the programs on it, and we told them how they should use it, and they were left on their own devices. And we thought, well, this is going to fail miserably. Okay. Uh, Surprisingly, however, on that high stakes exam, we have that same nice benefit for students who are using this program on their own in an unsupervised way. And we had the same replication with the major drop in retention of the content that wasn't successfully relearned. And even those unsupervised students, you see a really nice retention of that content over a month time. So since we ran this original study, I'll just fess up, I've talked a lot about successive relearning because for some reason I was convinced by this demonstration. And at the same time, I was giving other talks where I was kind of chiding other researchers who went out and told people about their cool findings based on one experiment. And I thought, oh my God, all I have is one demonstration this works. One demonstration is definitely not enough. We need to go and show whether this replicates or extends to other classes. And so in the last several years, we've started to do research now in a more broad way. And I'm going to show you evidence from biopsychology, and currently we're developing this for physics, chemistry, and biology to evaluate its efficacy for helping students in those domains. Why biopsych? It's the highest failure rate in this class in psych sciences. In fact, my chair came to me and says, please help Aaron Jasnow with this class. Students are failing miserable. Anything you could do to help boost grades and students to learn would be great. I said, well, we'll try successive relearning now. Now, for biopsych, there's a tsunami of information that needs to be learned. Definitions like often happen with intro courses like an intro psych, but also anatomical names. You need to learn basically the language of biopsychology, steps in a variety of processes, and so forth. And I asked Aaron, again, just like Sharon Scaratelli, give me your most important concepts that students need to learn for their first exam. Their first exam is 3 weeks into the semester. He gave me a list of 200 concepts. And I thought, wow, now I know why this class has the highest failure rate. So I've started coaching Aaron on less is more, what's really important. He came back and gave me 100 concepts to work with. Okay? It's like, that's still, hold on. Okay. For the latter two, the anatomical names and steps and processes, the students need to work with figures. So we had to write different programs to allow them to do this. And I'll give you a vision of what this is. This is just names, parts of the brain. And how a student would use it, it would point to the structure. They'd have to type the name in. That's wrong. They would get feedback. This is the correct answer. And then they would score it, in this case, not correct. And then they would be tested on that again. And it would go to the next and next and next. So that would be one flashcard stack for them. Right? For processes, kind of work the same way, except we decided to go lockstep. So this is action potentials, cell is at rest, so voltage gated, what happens? That's wrong. They'd get your response, correct answer, right? So they would study it, evaluate the correctness of theirs, and then it would go to the next step and the next step. So we did everything in sequence. Whether going in sequence is the best way or not, that's an empirical question. We just thought it would made more sense. And they'd go until they get everything right once. 48 undergraduates enrolled in this. For exam one, there were 5 required modules and 5 that were optional that had parallel content that was counterbalanced across students. And they were told they had to complete each module 3 times, distributed across at least 2 days apiece. And we gave the students an extra syllabus that was connected with these modules, when to use them, and so forth, to help them keep on track. And then, of course, we evaluated whether they kept on track. Importantly, I really think the technique works, although I want more and more evidence that it does. So in the first day class, I come with these flashcard programs, and I try to ruin my own experiment. Because I said, your professor wants you to learn all this content. You're required to use successive relearning for this flash drive. I'm going to give you all the optional content. Please, please, please use it, learn this content, right? Even though we wanted to show that the things that they learned successive relearning, they outperformed in the optional. but I wanted the students to even use the optional programs. And then we analyzed exam one performance and compared to a prior cohort. Again, his test questions, again, not far transfer, but they're not just tell me what you basically regurgitated during this successive relearning program. So near transfer questions. And again, in this class, we found about a letter grade improvement for the concepts that were successively relearned versus the optional and baseline. And note here, if you squint, you can see a little small effect because 4 or 5 students actually use the optional programs, and they're the ones that show the slight boost in performance, right? So with respect to the cohort comparison, I told Aaron, please do not change any aspects of your class. He was kind of pleased about that because we wanted to compare outcomes from the year before when they did not have successive relearning. These are data I showed you earlier, a successive relearning versus baseline control in the cohort that had successive relearning. And it turns out for the 2017 cohort, they do about the same for the baseline, and you see the nice boost there. Again, more evidence that the successive relearning is really what's having the impact on the student's knowledge. Good news is we did this again. We like to replicate. All of these outcomes replicated. Students actually loved it. Okay. So let me end the talk by just talking about a few barriers for adopting successive relearning for the ultimate success of this particular technique, because I think the barriers are extreme, okay, even though the preliminary evidence is positive. The first is, are there very few demonstrations of the efficacy? In fact, you just saw them. There are 2, those, okay? And it's because research is very difficult to do. Okay? You have to interact with students on multiple sessions. They have to relearn it. There's lots of scoring. We have big groups of students helping us pull off this research. We're trying to develop technology with Joe right now, as he mentioned earlier, where we have a platform that we can help other teachers not only use this in the context of their own classes, but teachers who are always also interested in the science of learning so they can evaluate its efficacy in their classes, so we could build more repository about when this works versus when it doesn't. We need to know how to improve its efficiency, understand the degree to which successive learning promotes transfer, whether students can guide their own use of this, and our preliminary evidence suggests that students use this very well on their own, and across a variety of different kinds of materials. So there's lots of research to be done here. And it needs to be done, I think, before we can give broad prescriptions on its use. It's also difficult to implement. Imagine if you're a student wanting to use this. You could develop flashcards. You also need, right, good time management skills. You need to know how to use a calendar, so on and so forth. Right? It turns out that flashcard programs are not designed to support successive relearning per se. Although for students out there, you're all aware there are flashcard programs available right online. Absolutely. Some of them are actually very good, okay? And some of them can be adapted to use with successive relearning. And in fact, we just did a review of all of the flashcard programs that we can get a hold of. And I'm not even going to go through this table, but the good news is some of these can be adapted to utilize successive relearning. The ones I like the most that you could put email reminders in there, say, oh, it's time for you to pick up this particular flashcard stack. Importantly, for the students out there who might want to use them, all of these, except for, I think it was Super Memo, you can share your stacks. So if you spend the time to develop a stack, you can share it with all your fellow students. If you're a teacher who wants your students to do this, you could develop the stacks and then share them with your students. Okay. They're relatively good, a little bit still deficient, and I hope Joe and I and Nabil really break the barrier and develop a program that's specifically suited to implement successive relearning. Barrier 3 is lack of motivation. This is why I need to be a social psychologist, to solve the motivation issue, okay? And let me just put meat on the bones of what I mean by lack of motivation. Before the first exam, when the students in biopsych were using our successive relearning program, about 11 of these 48 students wrote us unsolicited and just told us how much they were loving it. And let me highlight one. I would love it if there was a program like this for the entire class. It really motivated me to keep studying. I totally believe this student. Turns out we did have programs available. Okay? So for exam 2, right after exam 1, I came and showed them these effects. Wow, this really works. You guys wanted it. Look, you told me you wanted it. And they came greedily, snatched up all these flashcard programs. There was no requirement to use them. Only 3 of those 48 students used them to prepare for the next exam. Okay? And the 3 that used them didn't even use them with fidelity. That is, they didn't really successively relearn. Okay? Now note, the ones that were required, the students only received a small percentage of the grade. Actually, it was negligible. It's not enough to really kind of take the effort. But at least that little push made them schedule it in and actually get it done. And most of the ones, actually, one of the students in this class was Catherine Rawson's lab manager, who was extra excited about it, wanted to help us do research on it. She didn't use them. And her sense, well, when the rubber hit the road, I was just too busy, I couldn't do it, blah, blah, blah. So motivation is something that we need to consider how to help students do this. So a couple quick conclusions. At least the preliminary evidence indicates that successive relearning provides durable learning and can enhance student achievement on high-stakes exams. We found at least one context now where the application of successive relearning does not help students, and I'll be happy to talk about that as well. And it's nice to find out when a technique doesn't work and what cases it's limited. But right now, I think the preliminary evidence suggests that this is a relatively all-purpose technique, that if you really want to master something well and retain your mastery, you should need to use it. Okay? And this is for teachers. SR can be implemented easily using homework assignments, as I showed here. It's just developing the flashcard programs for the students to use. Hopefully, these will be available soon. And future research is needed to break down these barriers for successful implementation to help students use this. Again, not for all their classes, for all their content. It takes too much time. But to really encourage students to use this for the content that they really want to master well, especially in programs that build on one another, where you need to remember content in earlier classes to succeed in later ones. I think where this particular technique will be invaluable. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions. Yeah. Yes.
I just want a quick comment. I've been here for 15 years, and the first speaker I've ever had in terms of mathematical location is a fundamental concept. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that was awesome. So I come from a different world, working with people with cognitive impairment.
Yep.
And I'm trying to figure out how successive relearning fits with direct instruction and error control methods. So when you were saying doing it correctly enhances the benefit of successive relearning. So when you're teaching or when the students learning, you have to set them up to be successful. Even if students doing it themselves, they have to set themselves up to get the right answer a lot.
No. In fact, with this kind of content, the conceptual definitions are difficult. Okay. And the first responses, and this is why we had to develop techniques to help them score, the first responses kind of make sense, but they're just completely incorrect. So they have to realize, hold it, I have some of the right words, but I still don't have it down, so I have to relearn it. So this is definitely not a context where errorless learning is involved. There are plenty of errors that are going to be made until you get to the correct retrieval. In some areas, and Catherine, do you want to field this? Yeah, please jump.
Different requirements working with patients with acquired aphasia, in particular word naming difficulties. And we have implemented successive relearning schedules to help these individuals creating word naming versus errorless learning, versus repetition rather than naming practice in successive relearning. Even though they are making some errors in some of those early word naming attempts, the successive relearning, the basic successive relearning effect even stand out because of the patient.
Right, which is counterintuitive in the field where you want to use errorless learning because you don't want people to make mistakes. Well, it turns out in this case the mistakes aren't hurting, and basically
as long as they get feedback
and eventually get it correct, it boosts
the feedback is important.
So even when you're thinking about for students, then do they have to build in, somebody has to build in corrective feedback?
So, I'm sorry, with this? Or
with this, there
with
definitely
this?
is corrective
Yeah,
feedback.
because they get shown the right answer to
They can show on
restart.
the right answer.
Right, and note to help them actually evaluate whether they're correct or not, we break the correct answer down into its components. So they, like a rubric, do you have this part, do you have that part, which tends to help some students. Although they're pretty good for these simple kinds of conceptual differences, they're difficult, but they are hard to score. But when we get more and more complicated, so when we're starting to use this in biology and chemistry, they're going to need a lot of support to evaluate the quality of their answers and so forth, and something we'll have to work out. But yeah, errors aren't bad.
So a lot of your retrieval stuff was based on text input. So when you're trying to get them to recall some sort of definition, they're typing out some text and then checking their stuff. Have you done any of this with just multiple choice questions and offering kind of options for them to choose from and then feedback on why one answer was correct or incorrect, so to do?
No, I'd love to do it. Do you want to do some research together? This sounds like great. So, you'd think it may not be as potent because in some contexts, a multiple choice test doesn't lead to as big of a test effect as does kind of more recall from memory without any support. The research done in classrooms is slightly different, though. Mark McDaniel has some preliminary evidence that suggests that even the multiple choice testing in regular classrooms is just as potent because it has the indirect effect. It tells students when they don't know something, so they can go and correct themselves. Because in a real classroom, in contrast to the lab, you're going to have to know that later on. So when you miss it, you'll go and correct that. So yeah, I'd love to do that and evaluate it because there are all these test banks out there that could be used in this context. Yeah.
Probably missed it, but apart from one study, I didn't really see how the successive relearning is all that different from just more experience. We all know that more experience improves learning. So can you speak to that and to the efficiency of learning with this technique versus other techniques?
Absolutely. So two different things that are very important, efficiency versus just more experience. In that first study, and you didn't hear it because I didn't say it, the first study we had other control groups were just experience group where they go back and restudy it, like a standard space practice. We tried to equate for time. And testing until you get it right, it turned out was an active ingredient that helped boost their memory. Okay, so just having more experience, even spaced across time, is not as potent as testing yourself on that content, like engaging yourself on it. Don't get me wrong, it takes real time to do this, right? It's not, and in that first session when you're going to retrieve something correctly, it's like the first session when you're trying to learn something, anything new. It takes real amounts of time. And one thing that we think are very important when you're assessing the overall quality or effectiveness of a technique is not only the boost in performance, but also the efficiency of use, because students only have so much time, right? It's something that we're trying to get everyone to jump on board. It's like, don't even show me your technique, but show me the efficiency of that technique as well. And we're trying to improve the efficiency of this in a variety of different ways. So is it efficient? Yeah, when time on task is equivalent, you'll outperform when you're testing until you get it right than if you're just studying. But still, it takes real time. In other words, only the most dedicated students are going to use this for all the content. You just can't. So that's why when I work with teachers, please work hard to figure out what the most important content is that you want them to retain beyond this class, and then utilize these kinds of techniques which are focused on producing long-term durable learning for that content, but not for everything. But again, you're looking at some of the only demonstrations. Maybe we'll find with more that there are other techniques to use that might be more efficient or better. We just don't know yet. But yeah.
How does it work with implicit learning? If you have to judge artists' paintings or...
I don't know. I'm not sure. We've not done anything like that. Again, if there's feedback, what, sir? Yeah, and again, we want evidence for all this, and it's because these are most cognitive psychology research, and this is not, I'm not making any kind of claims of whether it's bad or good, or they're called one-shot experiments. You have one session, you do all your thing in that one day. And that's just, it's easy. You have your subjects there, and you could do your intervention. Education research is like that. Your intervention is on this one day and see if it works. As the dosage is so low, it's not ever going to be realistic for improving long-term retention. It's just difficult to do these multi-session studies to start evaluating important questions like you're doing. And we are trying to do it, and we're trying to get others involved. The reason why we've been able to do it partly is because I'm a computer programmer and I can develop the programs, right? But I just can't do it for everyone. That's just why I'm working with Joe and others to make basically platforms that are available for researchers and for students to evaluate when this won't be effective or good, or how to improve it. Yeah.
So in one of your the earliest studies you presented, you have two variables. One was lag, and one was successive relearning sessions.
Yep.
Okay. Both had an effect. In fact, the lag started to decrease across sessions. The question is the principle driving lag effects and the principle driving the successive relearning, like those effects, is it the same principle? And of course, then is it time? And is it necessarily time, or you see where I'm going?
Well, I mean, yeah, I do see where you're going. Do you have a spin on this? I think it's the same. Yeah.
The model that we fit predicted both of the effects, predicted the initial lag effect, actually predicted the diminishment of it, and also predicted the potency effects of dosage, all based on the same underlying assumption that strengthening related, K rates are instance K rates are a function of current strength. So there, at least in that
Model, one functional causal assumption.
Counts
did
for
all
both of the
things that
effects.
work.
But no, the key component to the effects are the forgetting. And then if you forget, to get the boost, you have to relearn. So successive relearning is built into the parameters. Yeah, this is the killer for 100 years of testing effect research. Very little of it is theoretical. So we know that it boosts retention, but how it boosts retention, I don't want to shrug my shoulders because there is some theory out there. Like one of the theories is, well, I'm developing good strategies to learn something. They aren't that good, so I forget those. I don't remember. And next time I generate a new set of strategies, and those are good. So it's almost like the survival of the fittest is one reason why these kinds of things could work. But I think the more we learn about why testing is so effective, the indirect effect, we might be able to boost the efficacy of these techniques to make them more efficient, right? Because it's all about time is a zero-sum game. And I used to think when I was younger and a teaching zealot, it's like, well, all my students are studying all the time, right? I mean, you go and you just spend your time in the library. And they should be doing that. Now I no longer think they are, they should be, right? So it's like, how are you going to spend your limited amount of time in the most effective ways? And this is not a panacea, by the way, for all learning woes, right? It's a very specific tool. Yeah, Andrew.
Maybe last question, Andrew. Sure. So, speaking to some of the theory behind testing effects, and in part in successive relearning, I guess one question I have is, a lot of the times the control condition is just this kind of ambiguous restudy condition, right? We just give them the information again and say, do something with it. I guess part of my question is the deficit of that restudy condition in part just because they're choosing a poor strategy when you're giving them that information? Like, retrieval, like to say, oh, the key ingredient for testing is that they're thinking back. Mm-hmm. Strictly speaking, people can also think back if you gave them the information.
Absolutely.
Right? So I guess my question is just related to the use of restudying as a control condition and what it entails for the actual test.
Right. So for the business's control, we don't know what they were doing with those, right? Probably cramming the night before, probably not doing a lot of looking back. It's just what they normally do. That's why I'm saying it's like, well, first, successive relearning, if it doesn't beat that, all bets are off. Question is, what are they doing? Why is it ineffective? We know they're not successive relearning, else they'd be just as good. That said, a couple of the groups that I did not mention that are in that original paper are, time uncontrolled kind of conditions where you're exposed just as much across the same lags and everything else. You just don't successively relearn, you just successively restudy. And that's better than not doing that. It still beats out barely business as usual, but it also highlights that one active ingredient is testing yourself, right, until you get it right. So time and just experience with the content is not enough to achieve these high levels of retention.
For anyone who has any additional questions, there is a wine and cheese reception immediately following on the second floor lobby for the McCall-McBain postdoc fellows. That's all we do around here. We just eat free food. So please join us, and we'll see you upstairs. Thank you very much, Sean.